because the mass of the planet that he predicted that should have lied in the asteroid belt would have been of the approximate same mass as the planet Saturn. So Van Flandern was led to postulate that this now missing planet, interestingly enough, 19th century astronomers nicknamed it Krypton.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. So, that opens up a whole host of other connections.
Oh, yes,
that have entered the modern iconography, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But this missing planet, Van Flandern, on the basis of the archaeological and geological evidence of asteroids, postulates was a water-bearing solid planet. In other words, it may possibly have been the home to intelligent life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I do in the book is, on that basis, then, I speculate that, well, if that's the case, then that life is possibly going to be of much larger physiology. In other words, giants. So one of the things that I look for in the Cosmic War is, as a bit of corroborating evidence of this, are there any giant remains? Because, of course, biblical and Sumerian traditions, as well as some Meso and South American traditions of Indian tribes over here, indicate that these giants came down, of course, from heaven and interbred with humanity and sired very large offspring.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, this is one of the interesting little bits of archaeological anomaly that I explore in the book, because there are, in fact, some rather astonishing giant remains. Even St. Augustine of Hippo, believe it or not, talks about some of these things. So it's an interesting thing, because it's a bit of corroborating evidence, in other words, from a very strange quarter, that possibly this planet was home to intelligent life of that sort.
Mm. Wow. And the mythological aspect here is definitely something I want to explore.
Sure.
But I think that before we go there, I want to ask you a little bit about the kind of the opening phrase or opening meaning of your blurb, basically, that says rejecting the naturalist and materialist assumptions of catastrophism from Velikovsky to Alford. I have a basic idea. I have a few articles up on redicecreations.com about Immanuel Velikovsky's research. I don't know that much about Alford, Alan F. Alford's work. But do you want to elaborate a little bit further what you mean with this passage here?
Sure. One of the things that I do in the book is I use Alan Alford as kind of a foil or an exemplar of various schools of catastrophism, because at least in terms of the United States and Canada, he's a rather popular author over here, and he's certainly one of the more scholarly proponents of catastrophism. But basically, in Alford's view, when we examine Greek or Sumerian or Egyptian mythological texts, any time that we are referring to things chimerical, such as sons of God or anything of that sort, what he takes it to mean is a metaphor for a meteor that is debris from an exploding planet that crashes to Earth. So in other words, to kind of cut to the chase, the method that he uses in his examination of those texts is a reduction of almost every type of mythological reference to nothing but a metaphor of some sort or another for an exploding planet.
Mm-hmm.
And this, to me, ultimately fails, because in my examination of the mythological texts, he comes up with an interesting formula. He says that mountains, if you encounter references to mountains in these texts, that's a metaphor for planets. If you encounter a reference to oceans, that's a metaphor for space. If you encounter references to wars, that's a metaphor for planetary collisions.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what I mean by naturalist assumptions. It's all a kind of a big mechanism, in his view, to explain catastrophism, and also, more importantly, to explain the rise of those mythologies. So
you don't quite agree with that idea?
No. The reason I don't is kind of twofold. On the one hand, there is the physics problem involved. If we have a large, massive body entering the solar system and colliding with a planet, it's going to have to do two things. The first thing is, it's going to have to leave a signature, or kind of a wobble, on the orbits of the planets. It's going to be rather analogous to floating a bunch of toy boats in a pond and then tossing a big rock into the pond. The boats are going to wobble and bob up and down on the pond. And the second thing it's going to have to do is it's going to have to overcome what's called the Roche limit, which is kind of a natural gravitational defense barrier that exists around any massive body. Any massive body entering that limit is going to be subjected to massive tidal stresses, and as a result, it will usually break apart, much like the comet Schumacher-Levy did prior to hitting Jupiter. So in other words, again, we're confronted with the problem of collision as a mechanism to explode a planet. You're going to have a massive body almost the same size as the planet that you're trying to blow up by that means. And the signatures just don't exist, in my opinion, for that to be a plausible explanation. The other thing that disturbs me about his particular approach is that when he turns to examine those texts that do refer to wars, he makes rather short shrift of them, because he comes up with this formula, as I indicated, of mountains equals planets equals gods, and then by implication that formula would say that wars equal collisions. But when you examine the texts themselves, there are a couple of other variables that he doesn't plug into his equation, and that really, if you examine them, means that his formula and therefore his examination of the text collapses. Because in the text, particularly the Sumerian texts, one of the other things that are referred to when the term mountains is used are precisely acres or ziggurats or pyramids. So in other words, the texts themselves, in the context of references to this war, are referring to a artificial structure that is somehow involved in these wars. So in other words, the metaphor, the reductio to accidental collisions and natural causes breaks down at that point. So I think, on that basis, his whole method is rather suspect. He wants to look at the text and see through everything, basically, in terms of the exploded planet hypothesis, and in the end he ends up really seeing nothing at all. The texts, to me, are very profound in that over and over again they insist, particularly the Sumerian texts, you just cannot read them without getting this impression that the people who composed them were thinking, as they were doing so, of real events. One of the texts I cite at great length in the book is the so-called exploits of Ninurta from the Sumerian. And I cite it, incidentally, just so your listeners will know. I do not rely on any translation of Zechariah Sitchin. I rely on English translations of accepted academics. And the reason for doing that is, of course, because Sitchin has had some criticism leveled at him for his translations. I want simply to avoid that and point out that the texts themselves are really saying what they say.
Do you know if there are big differences between the academics that have translated and what Sitchin has come up with?
That's an excellent question. Actually, to be quite honest with you, when I started reading some of these translations, one of them in particular is by a Syriologist at the University of Oxford. And in reading them, I have to be quite frank and tell you that I don't see all that big a distinction between Sitchin's
That's interesting. Yeah.
and some of these academic things. You know, and I find that rather interesting because, you know, to me this indicates that perhaps some that have leveled these criticisms against Sitchin are simply kicking against the goads. They may be just creating a bit of controversy simply to discredit the man, but I didn't find all that big of a difference between them. But in any case, this exploits of Ninurta, I cite this at length, and the reason partially for doing that in the book is to show people that this is a very strange text if it's a mythological text, because what it consists of is rather like a very dry bureaucrat's report on the technology that was inventoried by the victors in this ancient war as they went in and took apart the technology of the vanquished party. It's rather like reading one of those American or British intelligence reports as they went inside of Nazi Germany at the end of World War II. You know, and this goes on for pages and pages, Henrik. You know, it's it's very, very dry reading. But it's interesting because what they're doing is they're taking a technological inventory. And again, this rings very true because the Allies did precisely the same thing at the end of World War II. We wanted to find out what technology the enemy had, why in some areas they were so advanced, you know, what made all of this work. And in some cases we destroyed that technology. In other cases we simply carted it home and continued working on it. This is exactly what happens in the Sumerian text.
Wow, absolutely fascinating.
Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so this is, and this is, I mean, again, there are so many tablets that has been found throughout the years and so forth. But how did you go about, so to speak, kind of, you know, picking the good ones, so to speak, or how? Rather, my question is, how much information actually is out there and how much is available?
Well, in terms of translations, unfortunately there's not, at least in this country, there's not a great deal available. I had to special order a lot of the stuff that I used. They were publications of the University of Oxford or Yale University and so on. They're not something that you would be able to go into a bookstore over here and pick up. I would imagine that many of these publications are much easier to acquire in Europe. Over here, you know, these things are just not the typical reading that a person's going to go into and read, so it has to be special ordered. But there is a lot available and a lot that has been translated, but, you know, you ask a very good question, because my impression is, just from the research I did, is that no more than maybe 5 to 10% of it has been translated. The rest of it is still, there's such an enormous volume of it that has yet to be translated and released in a public fashion that, you know, and that, in a certain sense, that does raise some eyebrows of suspicion, too. I recall that when America and Britain went into Iraq in this debacle that continues to occur there,
unfortunately,
that one of the first things that was done was that notice was served to the French and Germans, you know, to get your archaeological teams out of there. And in digging through the reports on the Baghdad Museum looting, I discovered that the Germans were keeping the catalog of the things that they had unearthed for Saddam Hussein. So, you know, even that catalog is, as far as I've been able to trace thus far, is not really publicly available. So we don't know really what was taken during that looting, and to be frank with you, I'm a little suspicious that the supposed return of items that were looted, if they were in fact the same items. The whole affair just has a very, very bad ring to it, bad odor to it.
Could there be hints or suggestions among these artifacts on how to actually construct weaponry, and could there be